About 2 years ago, I had what I call my rebirth day. I was breastfeeding my daughter, Evietta, and when I stood up to put her down in her swing, I felt like I was going to faint. So I looked over at my husband, Eddie, and said, "Honey, I think I'm going to faint." And I got her into her swing, and I took a knee, and I felt like someone had taken a ballpoint pen and drew a line down my tongue, and the whole right side of my body went numb. It was like paralyzed. And so I was having a stroke. That day, I received a groundbreaking drug called TPA. TPA is a clot buster, so it goes in and breaks through clots and minimizes the effect of a stroke. It saved my life and allowed me to be able to hold my 3 babies and kiss my husband again. And I spent a lot of that year in rehab centers, so I got to go to the best rehab center in the country, in the world. It's in Chicago. And I got to work on just becoming a new person. They say, the reason I call it a rebirth day, or it is called a rebirth day, is because they say you're never the same after a stroke, and that is a true thing. I think it's a good thing, though. I think I'm a better person for it. Right? So I kind of got to know this new world for the first time again. I mean, like books I read before my stroke, I get to reread, so that's great. But a month after my stroke, doctors discovered that I had a 2-inch hole in my heart I was living with for my whole life. And the only way to close that hole was with open heart surgery. So open heart surgery is something where someone takes a saw and they saw down, you guys are like, we know. Saw down your chest, crack it open, pull your heart out while they put you on this machine that functions your heart and your lungs and helps you breathe, right? So you're on this machine and your heart's on ice, and then they sew it up, and then they put it back in, and they close you, and the doctor sews you up, and he does that with his hands. And so it was my only chance at living. I was headed toward heart failure, and my heart on my right side was twice the size as it was supposed to be. So when they asked me if I wanted to do the surgery, I was like, yes. Actually, I said, awesome. And which Eddie always is like, really? So we did the surgery, but I made that choice because here I was sitting at KU Med with one of the best heart teams in the world, and I'm in a shiny, beautiful hospital, and I'm thinking, yeah, let's get this done, and let's do it now. And so I'm going to show you a picture real quick, if I can. I better watch my mouth about the PowerPoint. So this is a picture of my family now. That's Claybel and Chaden and Etta and my husband, Eddie. So we wake up next to each other every morning. Like this morning, Chaden climbed into bed with us, the little one and the blondie, and we made a Chaden sandwich. I got to help Etta pick out her earrings, and Clay is just a powerhouse. But this picture could look very different. I'm part of the 4.5% of the world who lives in the United States of America. Land of the free, home of the brave. But if I lived somewhere else in the world, like let's say Uganda, I would have never received the drug TPA. I would have been completely debilitated. I probably wouldn't be here. And that picture would not look anything like it did. So I would be either dead, about to die, or something like that. So I spent many nights in rehab laying in a bed by myself thinking about this. Like, why do I get this treatment? Why me? Why do I get to have someone come in my room every 15 minutes and make sure I'm still breathing or that I'm okay? Do I need anything? When someone else is suffering across the world in a life that they did not choose. And even though it felt very unfair, I felt lucky to be on this side of the teeter-totter. There is no answer for this, but there is a responsibility that comes with it. One of my favorite verses of all time is this one: "To him whom much is given, much is expected." And ain't that the truth, but how do we get there? Some people are great at math, and some are writers, and some are crazy, weirdo, creative types like most of you. I wish I was more that way, but I believe my gift in this life is empathy. Empathy has the power to provoke change. And without empathy, we will never approach equality. My first true empathetic experience was in Puerto Cortez, Honduras. I stood in the middle of a gigantic trash dump that reeked of decay, and flies swarmed around me. Vultures circled overhead while sweat dripped off of my skin, and I wished I hadn't cut my pants so that my skin wouldn't touch anything. For 6 months during a mission trip, I got through moments like this by pretending I was going home to squeaky clean sheets and fluffy white towels after I washed my hair. I was so far from that. I looked down at the feet that protected, or at my feet and my shoes that protected them from all the broken glass and syringes around me, only to find a little pair of pitter-pattering feet running off into the trash dump. She was scurrying along with no hesitation, and I followed her as she bent over a pile of trash and put metal shards into a little trash bag and swung it over her back. This is how she made her money. She sold those pieces of metal so that she could have something to eat. I was invited into a one-room shack that day. It was crowded, and it had a ton of people and little artifacts from the dump hanging all around. On that table was a 3-foot plastic pink casket inhabited by a little baby boy with a swollen head. And I could see his face through a tiny plastic window on the top. I'll never forget that image. But a few days before, he had been chasing a garbage truck in hopes of finding a treasure to fill his belly, and had been hit by that truck. His sweet mother was asking me for money to bury him. I ran outside the shack and cried so hard I couldn't control myself. I started throwing up. I'd never cried like that before. I knew right in that moment that I was different. I looked up and I saw the volunteers standing around talking about how hot it was, and I couldn't pull myself out of that mother's sadness. My heart broke for her, and my soul literally ached for days and weeks. I kept thinking about her after I left, how she must feel to bury her son after she couldn't give him a better life, how she must have felt guilty for what he had become and what had become his reality, how she would be coming home that night and not hear his feet pitter-patter across her floor of her shack. I quickly realized that empathy was my gift in life. During my time in Honduras, I met a young girl named Daisy. She's the little girl on the right there. I was standing in a liquado shop, and she came up to me and asked me for a drink of my little styrofoam cup. And I remember touching her wrist and it being like the skinniest thing I'd ever felt. And I was used to 6-year-old wrists in the United States where kids had unlimited access to Go-Gurts and graham crackers. But she had bald spots from her hair falling out because she was so malnourished, and she had warts all over her body. But she had these really piercing green eyes that were so beautiful, and even though they were super bloodshot, they captivated me. I followed her for weeks and got to know her really well, and I got to know the other 11 kids in the pack she traveled with. They slept on cardboard boxes in the alley, and they didn't have parents to care for them. I would imagine Daisy's life. What would it be like to be Daisy if I were literally walking around with no shoes on this hot ground? You guys know it's summertime right now, and anytime you're like outside, how hot that must feel, but how must it feel all the time, right? I thought about what would it feel like if my heart was beating in her chest? How does it feel to be afraid of someone taking advantage of my little body? The question to ask was, what if I was her? I'm not sure people like to go there with empathy. It takes effort, and it usually takes you to a place you don't really want to go. But this is what life is about. If we want to know how we're going to make the world a better place, more equal, we need to get a little more uncomfortable. Daisy changed my life. I focus on her every single day still. And when the work we do at Halo seems overwhelming, or when people ask why do we want to grow, I close my eyes and remember that there's one more Daisy, just one more Daisy who wants to spend one less day alone. And Daisy could be you or me really easily. There's a wedge between us as humans. Our birthright is the wedge, which is the right which is the right of possession or privilege one has from birth. This is all by chance, or some say by divine plan. Either way, it's the way things are. I have never gone hungry. I've never been persecuted for my beliefs. I've never had to hold my baby during the biggest famine in history. Starving. What I am saying is that if you're sitting in this room, you're fortunate. It's not Daisy's fault that her birthright took her to a place where she was homeless, where she didn't have parents to care for her, where she was living in filth. But it is my fault if I didn't see her. There once was a girl who at the age of 4, her mother took her to her father's trailer and dropped her off. Her mother tied her up to the porch and left her there. It was freezing cold that day, and her dad came home that night from work, and there she was shivering, waiting for him. She ended up living like 3 years of severe abuse and neglect, and finally was taken away by child services, and ended up spending 11 different families, going to 11 different families, and she was actually adopted and kicked back into the system 2 times. So she had a rough life, and that was supposed to be the good option for her. She ended up getting dropped off at a homeless shelter when she was 18, and she met another boy who was also a foster kid who was dropped off at 18, and then she became pregnant. I met Casey when she was 6 months pregnant. I later held her leg up for her as she was giving birth. When I was asked to speak today, I thought about some of the most unequal moments that I'd ever experienced in life, and it was with her. One day, I picked her up from the homeless shelter, and we headed to hear the baby's heartbeat. It was supposed to be a happy day. We arrived at the community health center, and I stood by her side, and the receptionist couldn't see me. So she walked up to the window, and the woman said, "I'm going to need some ID, and I'm going to need your insurance card." Well, she was homeless. She didn't have a birth certificate or an ID or anything. And Casey looked at her and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have that." And she was like, "Well, you're not going to see a doctor today." And of course, I'm standing there like Aaron Brockovich, you know. So true. And I was like, "Who do you think you are? This is a teenager who's looking out for herself and her baby, and she's doing one of the bravest things she could possibly do. She will see a doctor, or I will talk to your supervisor." She's like, "Okay, well, we'll get her in." And so she got in that day, but I remember walking into the room. It was a completely different experience than anything I'd ever gone through. Okay, we were in like this place where there's curtains, so there were like 6 women in the room. And we sat down, and I could hear the doctor talking to the woman right next to me and her name and all her STDs, and I'm thinking, wow, HIPAA, we're right there. So Casey was sitting next to me, and when the doctor came in, he sort of treated her like she had a disease. She was like, or the doctor said to her, "What have you been drinking, and what drugs are you doing?" And I'm like, "Okay, well," and she's like, I haven't done anything." And she's like, she's like, "Well, what are you here for today?" She's like, "Well, we would like to hear the baby's heartbeat." And she's like, "All right, we're doing that." And she asked if she could have a sonogram. Well, she'd already had one, and that's all she got her entire pregnancy. So you can imagine how that felt. So when I gave birth a year later, things were quite different. It was less than a year, it was like 10 months later. I was treated like a queen. I'm sorry, I just had to get that picture in here. Okay, but everyone opened the doors for me, talked to me like I was bringing Jesus into the world. At my doctor's appointments, everyone asked me, "Oh, are you hydrated enough?" And they brought me these beautiful brochures of birthing suites, and what suite are you going to select? Do you want the one with the tub? And it was a totally different experience. Do you need a 3D ultrasound just in case you can't wait long enough to see what the baby looks like? So I was asked for my birth plan. My family was dying to see photos. They were fighting over who got to see the baby first. My husband was at home at my sweet home when I came home that night from giving birth, or not that night, a couple nights later. When she gave birth, she had no parents, no showering of gifts, nothing. When she gave her son up for adoption, she went home with a heavy heart and her breasts wrapped in ace bandages. So let's go back to that receptionist lady. That lady works in a public hospital where she's exposed to so much poverty, which includes people on drugs, mothers who don't care for their babies, people who treat her terribly. She's probably exhausted with sadness, and she put Casey into a box with a label on it. But if she could, just for a split second, use her imagination and imagine the best part of Casey when she was standing there, that maybe she does have good intentions for her baby. Maybe she is going to do something good for her baby. Perhaps she would have treated her with the dignity she deserved. I believe that equality starts with empathy. We all have our own experience. We all have our own reality. I don't know what it must feel like to walk around a 5'10" build African-American woman. I'd love to try it though. But one thing I can do is use my imagination. I'm not just talking about the empathy where it's take yourself and put yourself in someone else's shoes. I'm talking about taking your heart out of your chest and letting it be in someone else's. This is something we can do. We can use our imaginations to become more empathetic, and it will provoke change and it will bring equality. So I thought we might do a little exercise this morning. I want you all to pretend to be this girl. Like put your heart in her chest, put your mind in her mind. I want you to use your imagination. Be her for a minute, breathe her air. How does it feel? What differences are there? How do you walk differently? How do you talk? At the time of this photo, you're a 16-year-old girl living in the projects. And here's a bit about your background. As a child, you adored your daddy. He was the man you trusted and loved. He was fun-loving, would throw you up in the air. But that man, the man who made you giggle, one night took a family hostage and committed murder. You would never see your daddy in the world you knew ever again. He was gone. And you had a giant hole in your soul. You missed him dearly. And your mama, she had a hot temper, but you loved her. She was fierce and strong. But one day, she had a silly fight in a car and shot someone. So there, she was gone. And she and your daddy would now be in prison for your entire childhood. So here you are, with a gaping hole in your soul, trying to find a home, bouncing from place to place, always feeling like you have to tiptoe around the people around you to be on your best behavior in case they might kick you out. You desperately miss your mama, and when you get to talk to her, she promises to give you the life you deserve when she's out of prison. So as a teenager, she finally gets out, and this is the moment you're waiting for. You're going to finally have a family like the other kids in your school. You're going to finally have a mom who can take you to school and who can be there for you. Until it's not. Your mom finds a place in the projects, and you are the one who has to wake her up in the morning so that you can go to school. Bad people start coming around doing bad things, and you realize you are not your mom's top priority. She even allows you to have a live-in boyfriend when you're 15 years old. Even though you know it's probably not right, you do it, and all of a sudden, you become pregnant. Your mom becomes angry that you want to keep the baby, and she leaves you for months. And then one day, an eviction notice comes, and your heart is beating out of your chest, and you have nowhere to go. Now, I'm sorry we had to do that. It was a really uncomfortable one moment for us, wasn't it? But she was living in that moment to moment to moment to moment. In fact, that was her reality, every day, every night. In the same world you and I live in. Abused, hungry, abandoned, sick kids wake up like this all the time. This is the type of things people go through, and we have to be aware of that. Now, just a happy ending to that story. She now has, this is Amari, and this is her daughter Azaria, and she now fully supports herself in an apartment and has a job and is going to college, and Azaria is like the cutest thing in the entire world. Just in case you're like, what? When we talk about inequality, my experience has been with economic inequality. The kids we work with are homeless, on the wrong side of the tracks, with poor access to education, abusive families, and addicted to drugs. Their chances are not equal to a child born even 4 blocks from here. That is the inequality I see on a daily basis. I don't really have to use my imagination for those cases. I could stand up here and give you a ton of statistics about how unequal the world is. We're in the middle of a massive famine that no one really talks about. The largest refugee crisis the world has ever seen. In the United States, we're facing a huge opioid crisis that's crippling the foster system and is causing homeless kids to be all over. In Kansas City alone, there's over 2,000 kids on any given night who are homeless. The world is becoming more unequal. People are suffering, mothers are watching their babies die, grandmothers are sitting alone in nursing homes. So what's happening? I believe our most important job as humans is to truly love others as we would love ourselves. Now, if we really think about that, that is a lot to ask these days. We live in a society that centers around self, based on the number of likes we get for ourselves, constantly most concerned about self and self-happiness. And in this world, the only thing that will help us recover from a self-obsessed society is empathy. I have always thought of my job as being a communicator. My job is to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. I work with the super rich and the super poor. And when I say super rich, I'm talking about you and me. If you own a car, you're in the top 10% of the world. That's us. Whatever it is, we sit on one side of the teeter-totter over here, and then there's all these people over here. And all it takes is for us to scoot a little bit over to the middle and a little bit more over to the middle to equal things out, right? And put our hands out and help. I'm not just talking about giving money or things. I'm talking about giving of yourself. It doesn't take a trip across the world to find empathy. It takes your imagination. It takes putting yourself in situation after situation that is outside of your comfort zone and not ignoring what it does to you. It takes asking the question, what if that was me? And then acting accordingly. Thank you.